The howling wind cut through the dense pine forest like a blade, carrying with it the bitter sting of an approaching blizzard. James Carter, a rugged outdoorsman, trudged through the knee-deep snow, his breath escaping in heavy clouds. His rifle was slung over his back, not for hunting today, but for protection. He had come to check his traps, though he never enjoyed the practice. It was a means of survival, a way to keep food on the table in the remote Alaskan wilderness where he had lived alone for the past 5 years. As he moved deeper into the forest, a sound reached his ears, a low, guttural whimper. James froze, listening intently. The sound came again, this time weaker, almost pleading. He adjusted his fur-lined hood and moved toward the source. His boots crunched against the ice as he stepped into a small clearing. His breath hitched. There, half buried in the snow, was a massive gray wolf. The animal was tangled in a rusted wire trap, its powerful legs bound, its thick fur dusted with frost. Blood stained the snow where the metal had bitten deep into its flesh. The wolf's yellow eyes met his, a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and something else, something James couldn't quite place. Fear? No, it wasn't fear. It was a silent plea. James hesitated. Wolves were dangerous, unpredictable. A wounded one was even worse. But as he stared at the creature, something inside him stirred. He saw no malice in those golden eyes, only suffering. He took a slow step forward. The wolf growled weakly, but didn't move. "Easy, boy," James murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He dropped to one knee, assessing the situation. The wire had wrapped tightly around the wolf's hind leg, cutting deep into the muscle. If he didn't free the animal, it would either bleed out or freeze to death. James exhaled sharply and reached into his pack, pulling out a pair of thick leather gloves and a small wire cutter. The wolf flinched as James reached for the trap. It bared its teeth but didn't snap. It was too weak. James worked quickly, his fingers numb as he snipped through the twisted wire. The moment the last loop fell away, the wolf let out a sharp, pained yelp but remained still. James knew he couldn't just leave it here. It was too injured to walk, let alone hunt. It would die before morning. His survival instincts screamed at him to leave, to let nature take its course. But another part of him, the part that had softened over the years of solitude, wouldn't allow it. With great effort, he hoisted the wolf onto his shoulders. The beast was heavy, its thick fur matted with ice. He gritted his teeth against the strain and started the long trek back to his cabin. The storm worsened as he walked, snow whipping around him in furious gusts. His muscles ached by the time he reached his cabin, but he pushed through, kicking open the door and stepping inside. The warmth of the fire greeted him, and he carefully laid the wolf on a pile of blankets near the hearth. James grabbed his medical kit, cleaning the wound as best he could. The wolf remained still, its breathing shallow. He wrapped the injured leg, then sat back, watching the creature. "You better not bite me when you wake up," he muttered. Days passed. The wolf barely moved at first, only opening its eyes to watch James with quiet curiosity. James hunted, bringing back meat, and to his surprise, the wolf began eating. Slowly, its strength returned. One night, as James sat by the fire, sipping from a tin cup, he felt a presence beside him. He turned his head. The wolf was sitting there, staring at him. Something passed between them in that moment, a silent understanding. Then, without warning, the wolf did something James never expected. It lowered its head and nudged his hand with its nose, a gesture of gratitude. James chuckled, scratching the wolf behind the ears. "Didn't think you had it in you, buddy." From that day on, the wolf never left. It followed James on his hunts, moving silently through the trees like a shadow. It guarded the cabin at night, its keen senses picking up on dangers long before James could. Then one evening something changed. The wolf lifted its head, ears perked. A deep growl rumbled in its chest. James grabbed his rifle, stepping onto the porch. The forest was eerily silent. Then he saw them. Two figures moving through the trees, their movements too deliberate, too cautious. Poachers. James had dealt with their kind before. They hunted illegally, trapping animals for fur and sport. He tightened his grip on the rifle, but before he could act, the wolf lunged into the night. A chorus of startled yells echoed through the trees. Gunshots rang out. James' heart pounded as he rushed forward, but by the time he reached the clearing, it was over. The poachers were gone, their tracks disappearing into the snow. And the wolf stood there, blood dripping from its muzzle. James knelt beside his companion, running a hand through its thick fur. "You saved my life," he murmured. The wolf merely blinked, then, for the first time, let out a soft, almost contented huff. From that moment on, they were no longer just man and beast. They were brothers. The days turned into weeks, and the bond between James and the wolf, whom he now called Ghost, only grew stronger. Ghost was no ordinary wolf. There was a deep intelligence in his golden eyes, an understanding that went beyond mere survival. He wasn't just a wild animal. He was a guardian, a companion, something James never thought he needed. Life in the wilderness was unforgiving, but with Ghost by his side, James found a new rhythm. They hunted together, moved through the forest like two parts of the same spirit, and in the dead of night, when the wind howled through the trees, Ghost would sit by the cabin's door, watching over James as he slept. But peace never lasted long in the wild. One evening, as James was chopping wood near the cabin, Ghost suddenly raised his head, ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled deep in his throat. James stopped, following the wolf's gaze toward the distant tree line. Something was out there. James grabbed his rifle, his instincts kicking in. He had learned to trust Ghost's senses. If the wolf was uneasy, something was wrong. He moved cautiously toward the edge of the forest, his breath visible in the freezing air. Ghost followed, his massive frame tense, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. Then he saw it. A lone figure emerging from the shadows, bundled in thick fur, carrying a rifle over his shoulder. A stranger. James tightened his grip on his weapon, but didn't raise it. Out here, meeting another person could mean anything: friendship, danger, or something in between. The man stopped a few yards away, his face partially obscured by a thick scarf. His eyes, however, were sharp, scanning James and then flicking to Ghost, who stood protectively in front of his master. "Didn't expect to find anyone else out here," the stranger said, his voice rough. James studied him. "Same could be said about you." The man chuckled, lowering his rifle slightly. "Name's Tucker. Been tracking something through these woods. Big, fast, and dangerous." James didn't like the sound of that. "What exactly are you hunting?" Tucker hesitated, his gaze lingering on Ghost. "A wolf." James felt a cold dread settle in his gut. He shifted slightly, putting himself between Ghost and Tucker. "Plenty of wolves in these parts," he said carefully. "Not like this one," Tucker muttered. "This one's special. Worth a fortune." James' heart pounded. He knew exactly what this was. Ghost wasn't just any wolf, he was something rare, something unique. And that made him a target. "You're wasting your time," James said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Haven't seen any wolves around here." Tucker didn't look convinced. His eyes flickered to Ghost once more, and for a brief moment, James saw something dark behind them: greed. "Well," Tucker finally said, stepping back, "if you do see anything, you'd best be careful. This wolf's got a price on its head. Some people don't take kindly to letting money slip away." With that, he turned and disappeared into the trees. James didn't move until he was sure the man was gone. Then, he exhaled slowly, looking down at Ghost. The wolf stared back, his eyes full of understanding. He knew, just as James did, that trouble was coming. That night, James couldn't sleep. The thought of Tucker and whoever else might be hunting Ghost gnawed at him. He had saved this wolf once. He wouldn't let anyone take him away now. But the forest had other plans. Just past midnight, Ghost let out a low, warning growl. James shot upright, grabbing his rifle. He moved to the window and peered outside. The moon cast long shadows across the snow, but something was moving among the trees. More than one something. A flicker of torchlight. The glint of metal. The sound of crunching snow. James cursed under his breath. They had come. He moved quickly, securing his gear. If Tucker and his men thought they could just waltz in and take Ghost, they were in for a surprise. James wasn't some helpless hermit. He had lived in the wild long enough to know how to defend what was his. He turned to Ghost, who was already standing by the door, muscles tense, ready for whatever was coming. "You with me, boy?" James asked quietly. Ghost let out a deep, rumbling growl, an answer loud and clear. James cracked open the cabin door and stepped into the freezing night, rifle at the ready. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow. But the silence didn't last. A gunshot shattered the stillness. James ducked behind a fallen log as the bullet slammed into the side of the cabin, sending splinters flying. "Come on out, Carter." Tucker's voice rang through the trees. "We just want the wolf." James clenched his jaw. "Over my dead body." "That can be arranged," Tucker sneered. Another shot rang out, but this time, something moved before James could react. A blur of gray and white shot past him, Ghost. The wolf was a shadow in the snow, disappearing into the trees like a phantom. A scream cut through the night. Then another. James took his chance. He moved fast, weaving through the trees, using the darkness to his advantage. He spotted one of Tucker's men reloading his rifle and fired. The man dropped with a pained yell. Ghost was a force of nature, a blur of fangs and fury. The men had no chance against something they didn't understand, something wild, something untamed. By the time the last shot was fired, the forest was silent once more. The remaining poachers had fled, leaving their wounded behind. James stood there, breath heavy in the freezing air. He turned to see Ghost standing nearby, his fur stained with blood. Not his own. "You okay?" James asked, voice softer now. Ghost trotted up to him, nudging his hand the same way he had the night James saved him. James knelt beside the wolf, running a hand through his thick fur. "Looks like we make a damn good team." Ghost huffed, his golden eyes gleaming in the moonlight. From that night on, James and Ghost weren't just man and wolf. They were legend. The aftermath of the battle left James and Ghost standing amidst the silent, snow-covered wilderness. The poachers had fled, leaving behind broken weapons, trampled footprints, and the scent of fear hanging in the frozen air. James exhaled, his breath visible in the frigid night. His heart pounded with adrenaline, but his instincts told him this wasn't over. Ghost stood beside him, his thick fur bristling, golden eyes scanning the dark forest. He was wounded, nothing fatal, but James could see the crimson streaks against his silver-gray coat. James reached out, running a gloved hand along the wolf's side. "We need to get inside," he muttered. Ghost gave a low, approving grunt, and together, they moved toward the cabin. James kept his rifle at the ready, his senses on high alert. He knew men like Tucker didn't give up easily. They'd be back, and next time, they'd come prepared. Inside the cabin, James quickly got to work. He stoked the fire, casting a warm glow over the wooden interior. Ghost stretched out on the floor near the hearth, his powerful body relaxing slightly, but his ears remained perked. James fetched his medical kit and knelt beside him. "Let me take a look," he said, gently parting the thick fur where the blood had dried. Ghost didn't flinch, didn't growl. He simply watched James with those deep, intelligent eyes. "Looks like you took a graze," James murmured, carefully cleaning the wound. It wasn't deep, but it needed tending. As he worked, his mind raced. The poachers knew about Ghost now. They knew where James lived. Staying here wasn't safe anymore. He needed a plan. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. James glanced toward the door, half expecting Tucker to kick it down at any moment. He had been living in solitude for so long, but now he was being hunted. Not just him, Ghost too. James ran a hand through his beard, thinking. There was a town about 50 miles south, a small place where trappers and hunters sometimes gathered for supplies. He could go there, get information, maybe even find out if there was a bounty on Ghost's head. "We leave at first light," he muttered. Ghost flicked his ears but said nothing. James finished dressing the wolf's wound, then sat back against the wooden wall, staring into the fire. His cabin had been his sanctuary for years, but now, for the first time, it felt vulnerable. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow, everything would change. The journey south. The morning came with a sky painted in shades of icy blue and soft pink. James packed light, just enough food, ammo, and supplies to last the journey. He slung his rifle over his back, pulled his fur-lined coat tight, and stepped outside. Ghost followed, his steps silent against the freshly fallen snow. The journey was treacherous. The landscape was vast, a never-ending expanse of white and towering pines. Snow fell lightly, swirling in the wind. James kept his pace steady, his eyes scanning the horizon. Ghost moved like a shadow beside him, his keen senses always alert. They traveled for hours, crossing frozen rivers, navigating through dense woods. The silence of the wilderness was both beautiful and unnerving. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, just past midday, Ghost stopped. His body tensed. His ears stood erect. A low growl rumbled in his throat. James froze. He followed Ghost's gaze and saw it. Tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. Fresh. James knelt, examining them. Several men, moving quickly, headed in the same direction they were going. Damn, he muttered. Tucker's men. James clenched his jaw. He had hoped they had given up, but clearly they were persistent. And if they were headed south, it meant only one thing. They were planning an ambush. James tightened his grip on his rifle. He had two options: turn back and find another route or face whatever was waiting ahead. He looked at Ghost. The wolf was already watching him, waiting for his command. James sighed. We keep moving. Ghost let out a soft huff and continued forward. The forest grew thicker as they advanced. The trees closed in around them, casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground. James moved cautiously, every muscle in his body tense. Then he heard it. The unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. James barely had time to react before a voice called out, "Drop your weapon, Carter." James turned slowly, his heart pounding. Tucker stood on a small ridge above him, rifle aimed directly at his chest. Behind him, two more men emerged from the trees, their faces hidden behind scarves. "You don't give up, do you?" James said, his voice calm despite the situation. Tucker smirked. "Not when there's money involved." His eyes flickered to Ghost. "That wolf is worth more than you can imagine." James tightened his grip on his rifle. "And you're willing to kill for it?" Tucker shrugged. "That's how the world works." James' mind raced. He was outnumbered. He could fight, but the odds weren't in his favor. Then, before he could make a move, Ghost did something unexpected. But the forest had other plans. Just past midnight, Ghost let out a low, warning growl. James shot upright, grabbing his rifle. He moved to the window and peered outside. The moon cast long shadows across the snow, but something was moving among the trees. The wolf stepped forward, locking eyes with Tucker. For a moment, everything was still. Then, Ghost let out a deep, guttural snarl, one so primal, so terrifying, that even Tucker hesitated. James saw his chance. He moved fast, diving to the side as he pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the trees. Tucker's men scrambled, one firing wildly into the snow. Ghost was faster. The wolf lunged, a blur of fur and fangs. He took down one of the men instantly, his powerful jaws clamping onto the hunter's arm. The man screamed, dropping his rifle. James rolled behind a fallen log, reloading. Another shot rang out. Tucker cursed, diving for cover. Chaos erupted in the forest. James fired again, hitting the second man in the leg. He went down with a grunt. Tucker, realizing he was outmatched, scrambled back. Ghost turned, blood staining his muzzle, his golden eyes locked onto Tucker. The poacher hesitated, then did the only thing a coward would do. He ran. James exhaled, lowering his rifle. Ghost stood over the fallen men, his breath heavy, his fur bristling. James stepped forward, placing a hand on the wolf's head. "We did it, boy." Ghost gave a low, victorious growl. But James knew it wasn't over. Tucker was still out there. And as long as he was alive, he wouldn't stop. James took a deep breath, staring into the endless wilderness ahead. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was war. The forest had fallen into an eerie silence. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, landing on James' coat and the thick fur of Ghost, who stood beside him like a guardian carved from the wilderness itself. The bodies of Tucker's fallen men lay motionless in the snow, their breath no longer fogging in the cold air. But Tucker had escaped. James knew this wasn't over. The man had seen firsthand what Ghost was capable of, what they were capable of together. Tucker wouldn't let this go. He would regroup, find more men, and come back stronger. Ghost growled low, his golden eyes scanning the dark tree line. He was sensing something James couldn't yet see. "We can't stay here," James muttered, tightening his grip on his rifle. Ghost didn't need to be told twice. The massive wolf fell into step beside James as they turned and moved deeper into the wilderness. The cold bit at James' exposed skin, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were racing. If Tucker was heading south, toward the nearest town, that meant he was going to spread the word about Ghost. He might even put a bounty out. If that happened, every hunter and poacher in the region would be looking for them. They needed a new plan. James didn't want to admit it, but there was only one real option. He had to leave this place. His cabin, his home. He had lived in these mountains for years, surviving through the harshest winters, making a life where few dared to. But now, the life he had built was under threat. And he wasn't about to let some greedy poacher take it all away. His mind settled on one idea: the valley to the north. Few men ever ventured there. It was rumored to be too dangerous, too wild even for seasoned trappers. But James had been there once, years ago. He knew the land. If he could make it there, he and Ghost could disappear. But first, they had to survive the night. The pursuit begins. As dusk settled, James and Ghost found shelter in a small cave hidden beneath a rocky overhang. James gathered wood, his hands stiff from the cold, and started a small fire. The light flickered off the damp stone walls, casting long shadows. Ghost lay beside him, his injured side rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. James checked the wound again, still not too deep, but it needed rest to heal. "We'll move at first light," James murmured, running a hand through Ghost's thick fur. The wolf made a low rumbling noise, somewhere between a growl and a sigh, as if agreeing. James leaned against the rock wall, exhaustion creeping into his bones. His mind drifted back to the life he once had before the wilderness became his only refuge. He hadn't always been alone. Once, long ago, he had been a soldier, a man who had seen too much, done too much. When the world became too loud, too cruel, he had walked away from it all, choosing solitude over the ghosts of his past. And now, here he was again fighting. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just as sleep began to pull him under, Ghost's ears twitched. The wolf lifted his head, his sharp eyes flicking toward the cave's entrance. James' instincts kicked in instantly. He grabbed his rifle and held his breath, listening. Then he heard it. Crunch. The sound of a boot pressing into fresh snow. James and Ghost locked eyes. Someone was out there. Moving silently, James put out the fire with a handful of snow. Darkness swallowed the cave. He pressed himself against the wall, rifle raised, fingers steady on the trigger. Ghost moved like a shadow, inching toward the entrance, his body tense, ready. The footsteps grew closer. A silhouette appeared against the faint moonlight outside. James could make out a figure, moving cautiously, as if searching for something. Or someone. Then the stranger spoke. "Carter, I know you're in there." James' pulse quickened. It was Tucker. A deadly game. James didn't respond. He knew better than to reveal his position. Tucker took a step closer. "I don't want to drag this out, Carter. We both know how this ends. You hand over the wolf, and I let you walk away." Ghost let out a deep, guttural growl. Tucker chuckled. I figured you'd be stubborn." A flicker of movement in the corner of James' eye caught his attention. More figures approaching from the trees. Tucker hadn't come alone.
Damn it.
James made a decision. In one swift motion, he fired. The bullet ripped through the night, striking the rock beside Tucker and sending shards flying. Tucker cursed, diving for cover as James and Ghost moved. They burst from the cave like a force of nature, Ghost lunging toward one of the men while James rolled into the snow, firing as he went. A shot whizzed past his ear. He ducked behind a boulder, reloading. Ghost was a blur in the darkness, his snarls and the screams of Tucker's men echoing through the trees. James took down another hunter, then turned to find Tucker. But the poacher was already running. James swore under his breath and sprinted after him. Snow kicked up around his boots as he chased Tucker through the trees. Ghost, sensing the pursuit, broke off from the fight and joined him, his powerful legs propelling him forward. Tucker stumbled, crashing through the underbrush, but James was gaining. He raised his rifle. Crack. The ice beneath Tucker's feet shattered. James skidded to a halt as Tucker plunged into the frozen river below. The water was merciless, swallowing him in an instant. He gasped, clawing at the jagged ice, his rifle slipping from his grip. For a moment, James just watched. Watched as the man who had hunted them, who had threatened their lives, now fought for his own. Then, something inside James shifted. Cursing under his breath, he slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped toward the edge. "Damn it, Tucker," he muttered, reaching down. Tucker's wide, desperate eyes met his. He hesitated, then grabbed James' arm. James pulled. With one final heave, he dragged Tucker onto the snow-covered bank. The poacher lay there, shivering, coughing up water. He looked up at James, confusion flashing across his face. You saved me," he choked out. James stood over him, his expression unreadable. "I don't kill men who are already beaten." Tucker stared at him, then at Ghost, who stood nearby, watching. Finally, he let out a ragged laugh. "Guess that makes you a better man than me." James didn't respond. He simply turned, motioning for Ghost to follow. As they disappeared into the trees, he knew one thing for certain. This war was over. But the legend of the man and his wolf had only just begun. James and Ghost disappeared into the thick forest, leaving behind the broken remnants of the battle. The cold air bit at James' face, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing. Tucker was alive, but humiliated. The other poachers were either dead or had fled. But James knew men like Tucker. He wouldn't forget this. He wouldn't forgive it. Ghost moved beside him, his injured side still stiff, but his stride strong. The wolf's golden eyes scanned the trees, ears constantly twitching for any sign of danger. James trusted those instincts more than his own. "We need to keep moving," James muttered, tightening the strap on his rifle. "We head north, stay off the main trails." Ghost let out a low grunt of approval. James knew the valley to the north was their best chance at disappearing for good. It was a place few men dared to go. Rugged terrain, deep caves, and treacherous cliffs made it nearly impossible for most hunters to navigate. But James had been there before. He knew its secrets. And more importantly, he knew that once they reached it, they could finally be free. But the journey wouldn't be easy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest took on an eerie stillness. Snow crunched under their boots and paws, the only sound breaking the silence. James felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, but he pushed forward. He had been running for days now, and every second wasted meant giving Tucker another chance to catch up. Ghost suddenly stopped. His ears perked. His body went rigid. James followed his gaze and saw them. Tracks in the snow. Fresh. Human. He crouched, pressing his fingers into the prints. "Damn it," he muttered. They weren't alone. Ghost let out a soft growl. James scanned the trees, his heart pounding. If Tucker had sent men ahead, they could be waiting in an ambush. They had to be careful. He adjusted his grip on his rifle and whispered, "Let's move." Ghost led the way, his steps silent as a shadow. James followed, weaving through the thick trees, every sense on high alert. The tracks continued, leading up a narrow incline. James' gut told him this was a trap. But he had no choice, he had to take the risk. As they climbed, the wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers of something unseen. The air was thick with tension. Then a gunshot. James barely had time to react before the bullet whizzed past his head, slamming into a tree behind him. He dropped to the ground, rolling into the cover of a fallen log. Ghost snarled, his fur bristling. Another shot rang out. James peered over the log, spotting movement in the trees. 2 men. They were well hidden, their rifles aimed directly at him. Tucker's men. James clenched his jaw. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't outmatched. He took a deep breath, then fired. The shot hit its mark. One of the men cried out, dropping his weapon as he fell backward into the snow. The second man ducked behind a tree, returning fire. James moved fast, darting through the underbrush, using the terrain to his advantage. Ghost circled wide, disappearing into the shadows. Then, from the corner of his eye, James saw it. A third man moving behind him. Too late. A powerful force slammed into him from behind, knocking the rifle from his hands. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his ribs. Snow exploded around him as the attacker pinned him down, a knife flashing in the moonlight. James struggled, but the man was strong. He pressed the blade against James' throat, grinning through gritted teeth. "This is the end, Carter." Then, before James could react, Ghost struck. The wolf came out of the darkness like a phantom, his massive jaws clamping onto the attacker's arm. The man screamed, dropping the knife as Ghost dragged him off James, teeth sinking deep into flesh. James wasted no time. He grabbed his pistol and fired, one shot clean and final. The man went still. Ghost released his grip, panting, his muzzle stained with blood. James pushed himself up, wincing. His body ached, but he didn't have time to dwell on the pain. The second shooter was still out there. He turned, scanning the trees, just in time to see the remaining poacher fleeing into the woods. James raised his pistol, but hesitated. Killing a man running away wasn't his style. Instead, he lowered his weapon and watched as the coward disappeared into the darkness. Silence settled once more. Only the wind remained. James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. That was close. Ghost let out a low rumble of agreement. James knew this wasn't the last of them. Tucker still had more men.
But they had bought themselves time.
He turned toward the mountains in the distance, where the valley lay hidden beneath layers of untouched snow. "We keep moving," he said. Ghost nodded, as if he understood. And together, man and wolf vanished into the wilderness, determined to claim their freedom, no matter what dangers lay ahead. The night stretched endlessly as James and Ghost moved deeper into the wilderness. The snow-covered trees whispered in the wind, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky, like the hands of lost souls. The encounter with Tucker's men had left James bruised and exhausted, but there was no time to rest. He had spent years surviving in the harshest conditions, but now, for the first time in a long while, he felt truly hunted. Ghost walked beside him, his breath visible in the freezing air. The wolf was silent, his ears perked, always listening. James trusted him more than he trusted his own instincts. Ghost had saved his life more than once now. There was a connection between them, something beyond words, beyond understanding. James adjusted the strap on his rifle and kept walking. His ribs ached where he had been tackled. The cold gnawed at his fingers despite his thick gloves. But pain and exhaustion were things he had learned to ignore long ago. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting to the valley. The valley to the north was a place untouched by man. Few dared to venture there, and those who did rarely returned. The land was wild, treacherous, and unforgiving, but that made it the perfect place to disappear. They walked for hours, crossing frozen rivers and climbing steep ridges. The moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape, turning the snow into a silver sea. Every so often, James would stop and listen. The forest was too quiet. No birds. No distant howls. Only the crunch of their footsteps in the snow. Ghost suddenly stopped. James froze. His breath caught in his throat. The wolf's ears twitched. His fur bristled. His golden eyes locked onto something unseen in the darkness ahead. James tightened his grip on his rifle. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Then he heard it. A twig snapping. His heart pounded. Someone was out there, watching. James scanned the darkness, his pulse quickening. He couldn't see anything, but he knew better than to doubt Ghost's instincts. Then, out of the shadows, a voice. "I know you're there, Carter." James went rigid. "Tucker." The poacher stepped into the moonlight, his face twisted into a smug grin. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, but James knew better than to assume he wasn't dangerous. Ghost growled low, his muscles tense like coiled steel. James took a slow step forward, keeping his rifle at the ready. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Tucker chuckled. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." James said nothing. He had no regrets about saving Tucker from the icy river. But he also knew that mercy didn't change men like him. Tucker's grin faded. "That wolf's worth a fortune. You really think you can keep running forever?" James exhaled, his breath turning to mist in the cold air. "I don't need to run. I just need to make sure you stop following." Tucker smirked. "That's so." A rustle in the trees. James' stomach dropped. More men. This wasn't just Tucker. He had brought reinforcements. James' mind raced. He was outnumbered. If they tried to fight their way out, they wouldn't last long. He needed a different plan. Ghost growled, his body low to the ground, ready to strike. James made a decision. He turned and ran. Ghost sprinted beside him as gunshots rang out, bullets kicking up snow around them. James zigzagged through the trees, using the terrain as cover. The deep snow slowed him down, but he pushed forward. Behind him, Tucker's men gave chase. James' lungs burned as he ran. He could hear the hunters closing in, their shouts cutting through the night. Then he saw it, the gorge. A massive ravine split the land ahead. Jagged cliffs lined either side, the drops so deep that darkness swallowed the bottom. James skidded to a stop at the edge. He glanced back. Tucker's men were closing in. He had seconds to decide. He looked at Ghost. The wolf didn't hesitate. He leaped. James cursed under his breath. Damn it. And then he jumped. For a brief moment he was weightless. The cold wind howled around him. His stomach lurched. Then impact. He landed hard on the other side, rolling through the snow. Pain exploded through his shoulder, but he forced himself up. Ghost stood beside him, watching as Tucker and his men skidded to a stop at the edge of the gorge. Tucker's face twisted in rage. "You're just delaying the inevitable, Carter." James met his gaze.
"No."
"I'm ending it." Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Ghost followed, silent as a shadow. They didn't stop moving until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. The air grew colder, the trees grew denser.
They were deep in the wild now.
Deeper than most men had ever gone. Only when James was certain they were safe did he finally slow down. He collapsed against a tree, his chest heaving. Ghost sat beside him, his golden eyes reflecting the moonlight. James let out a shaky breath. "We made it." The wolf let out a quiet huff, as if agreeing. James knew they weren't completely safe. Tucker was still out there. But they had done what they needed to do. They had escaped. For the first time in a long while, James allowed himself to close his eyes. Tomorrow, a new life would begin. The wind howled through the towering pines, sweeping icy tendrils of snow across the frozen earth. James leaned against a massive tree trunk, his breath coming in ragged clouds, his body aching from the long chase. Beside him, Ghost sat silently, his golden eyes scanning the dark forest, ears flicking at every distant sound. The gorge had given them a temporary escape, but James knew better than to believe Tucker would give up so easily. He had bought them time. Nothing more. The valley lay just beyond the next ridge, but they couldn't afford to rush blindly forward. If Tucker's men had already figured out their destination, they could be setting an ambush. James pulled his rifle close, fingers flexing against the freezing steel. He had made it through worse, far worse. But this wasn't just about him anymore. He glanced at Ghost. The wolf had stuck by his side, through pain, through danger, through moments when escape seemed impossible. And now, they were bound together by something deeper than survival. Ghost suddenly let out a soft, guttural growl, his breath misting in the air. James followed his gaze and saw movement between the trees. A shadow. Slow. Cautious. Watching. James raised his rifle, but something held him back. Whoever it was, they weren't rushing in like Tucker's men had before. They were studying him, measuring their next move. Then a voice.
Low.
Rough. Unfamiliar. "You're a long way from home, Carter." James narrowed his eyes, gripping his weapon tighter. The man stepped forward, revealing himself in the pale moonlight. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, his face lined with the marks of a man who had seen too much. A heavy coat covered his broad shoulders, and a rifle was slung across his back, but he hadn't drawn it. Ghost remained tense, but he didn't lunge. James' mind raced. This wasn't one of Tucker's men. "Who are you?" James asked, keeping his voice steady. The man smirked. "No one important. Just someone who's been living out here long enough to know trouble when I see it." He glanced at Ghost, then back to James. "And you, my friend, are dragging a whole lot of it behind you." James didn't lower his rifle. "If you know who I am, then you know I don't have time for games." The stranger chuckled. "That's fair. Name's Elias. And if you keep heading north, you're gonna walk right into a death trap." James frowned. "Explain." Elias sighed, taking a slow step closer. "Tucker ain't just some two-bit poacher. He's got connections. He sent word ahead. Put a bounty on that wolf of yours. There's men waiting in the valley. Good men. Desperate men. The kind who won't hesitate to put a bullet in both of you if it means collecting a payday." James' jaw clenched. He had expected resistance, but not this. Elias studied him. "You've got two choices, Carter. Walk into that valley and die, or let me show you another way." Ghost let out a warning growl, clearly uneasy. James wasn't far behind him. He had trusted people before. It had cost him everything. But something about Elias felt different. The way he carried himself. The way he spoke. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't cocky either. He was offering something. Not demanding. James exhaled. "What's the other way?" Elias grinned. "There's a passage. A hidden one. Old mining tunnels that run beneath the valley. Dangerous as hell, but they'll take you through the mountains without anyone ever knowing." James didn't like it. Underground meant limited sight, limited options. But if Tucker's men were really waiting ahead, he might not have a choice. Elias must have seen. James studied Elias, his mind racing. Could he trust this man? He had spent years surviving in the wild, relying on nothing but his instincts, and those instincts were screaming at him that Elias wasn't lying. If Tucker had truly put a bounty on Ghost, then walking into the valley would be suicide. Ghost growled softly beside him, still wary, but he hadn't lunged. That was enough for James. "Show me," James said. Elias nodded and turned, moving through the trees with the ease of someone who had lived in the wild for years. James and Ghost followed, stepping carefully, listening for any sounds of pursuit. The forest stretched endlessly around them, the trees bending and creaking under the weight of winter. They walked for nearly an hour before Elias finally stopped in front of a rocky outcrop. At first, it looked like nothing more than a wall of stone, but as Elias moved closer, he reached for a pile of fallen branches and pushed them aside, revealing a dark opening barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. "This tunnel was part of an old mining operation," Elias explained. "Abandoned decades ago. It runs beneath the valley and comes out on the other side of the ridge. No one knows about it, which means no one will be waiting for you." James peered inside. The passage was dark, damp, and narrow. Ghost sniffed the air and let out a low grunt, clearly unhappy. Elias chuckled. "Yeah, he's not gonna like it. But it's either this or a bullet." James hesitated. Once they entered, there would be no turning back. If something went wrong inside, if the tunnel collapsed, if someone was already hiding in there, it could be a death trap. But then he thought about Tucker.
About the bounty.
about the men waiting in the valley with rifles, ready to claim their prize.
No.
This was the only way. James took a deep breath. Let's go. One by one, they slipped into the tunnel.
Underground.
The darkness swallowed them immediately. The air was damp and stale, thick with the scent of earth and decay. James kept one hand on the rocky wall as they moved forward, feeling his way through the narrow passage. Ghost stayed close, his body tense, ears constantly twitching. Elias led the way, his movements slow but confident. Stay close. Some parts of this tunnel are unstable. The ground beneath them was uneven, littered with loose stones and rotting wood. Every few steps, the ceiling dripped, sending cold water splashing onto their shoulders. Time seemed to stretch in the darkness. Minutes felt like hours. The deeper they went, the more suffocating the air became. James could hear Ghost breathing heavily beside him, uncomfortable in the enclosed space. Then suddenly a noise. A faint rustling deep ahead. James froze, gripping his rifle. Did you hear that? Elias stopped.
Yeah.
Ghost let out a soft growl, his golden eyes locked onto the darkness ahead. Then movement. Something shifted in the shadows. James raised his weapon. Who's there? For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the darkness, a ragged voice. Help me. James' heart pounded. The voice was weak, desperate. Someone was in here. Elias muttered a curse. Damn it. I was afraid of this. James turned to him. What do you mean? Elias sighed. You're not the first to come through here. Some folks try to hide in these tunnels. Not all of them make it out. James tightened his grip on his rifle. Then we help him. Elias hesitated, but then nodded. Careful. We don't know who he is. They moved forward cautiously, their footsteps echoing off the damp stone walls. The passage widened slightly, revealing a small chamber where a man lay slumped against the wall. His clothes were torn, his face pale, his body shivering from the cold. James knelt beside him.
Hey.
Can you hear me? The man's eyes fluttered open. They left me, he rasped. James frowned. Who left you? The man swallowed hard. Tucker and his men. They used me, but when I got hurt, they left me here to die. James felt his blood boil. Tucker had always been ruthless. But this? Leaving one of his own men to die in a cold, dark tunnel? Elias sighed. We can't leave him. But we can't carry him either. James thought for a moment, then reached into his pack and pulled out a canteen. Drink this. We'll help you out of here. The man took a shaky sip, his hands trembling. Ghost watched him carefully, his ears twitching with every movement. Elias glanced ahead. We're close. Once we're out, we figure out what to do with him. James nodded, then turned back to the injured man. You're lucky we found you. The man let out a weak chuckle. Yeah, lucky. Freedom. They pressed forward, moving slower now with the injured man leaning on James for support. The tunnel began to widen, and a faint glow appeared in the distance. The exit. James felt a surge of relief. They were almost there. Finally, they stepped out into the open air. The sky stretched above them, endless and blue, the first light of dawn creeping over the mountains. The valley lay behind them, far below. They had made it. James inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp, fresh air. Ghost stepped forward and lifted his head, letting out a low, satisfied howl. Elias turned to him. So, what now? James looked at the injured man. He couldn't just leave him here. We get him somewhere safe. Then I disappear. Elias nodded. There's a cabin a few miles from here. It's abandoned, but it'll do. James helped the man to his feet. Let's go. James knew Tucker wouldn't stop looking. He knew the bounty would still be out there. But for now, they had won. They had escaped. And no matter what came next, he and Ghost would face it together.
The end.